Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The planet, Seriphus, was a lifeless world covered in endless stretches of ice and snow. Its pale, cold surface shimmered beneath a dim, distant sun, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for eternity. A bitter wind howled across the plains, tearing through everything in its path, its icy fingers creeping into every crack and crevice, leaving nothing untouched. The planet's frigid atmosphere was barely breathable, making it a hostile place for most lifeforms. Yet, there she was, an alien figure, barely recognizable against the stark white backdrop, collapsed in the snow. Her skin, a shimmering shade of violet, was nearly lost against the frozen ground. She lay there, motionless, her breathing shallow and labored, each inhale a desperate gasp for air. Her dark, shoulder-length hair clung to her face, frozen in place by the cold. Her eyes, once vibrant with the light of distant stars, were now dull and clouded, the cold stealing the life from her. She was a visitor, an explorer from a faraway star system, but her ship had crashed, its once pristine hull now a twisted, smoking wreck miles away. She had survived the crash, but the icy planet had been unkind to her. The cold was unbearable, her strength ebbing with each passing hour as the relentless blizzard raged around her. She had tried to move, to find shelter, but the storm had disoriented her, and her energy had long since been depleted. Now, she was on the verge of death, the only sound in the world her ragged breathing and the relentless wind. Her thoughts were slow, growing distant as the cold gnawed at her, but one thought pierced through the fog in her mind, a question that refused to die. Why did I come here? The answer was buried in the debris of her ship. A critical mission, a scientific expedition to study a strange anomaly near Seriphus's North Pole. But the ship had malfunctioned, and now, here she was, alone in the cold, her life slipping away as the wind screamed its victory. Just as her vision blurred and her consciousness began to fade, something shifted in the wind. A sound, sharp, mechanical, and powerful, cut through the blizzard, vibrating the snow beneath her. The roar of an engine, the hum of something, alive. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and through the haze of cold and fading awareness, she saw it. A figure, a silhouette, cutting through the storm like a predator on the hunt. It moved with purpose, powerful strides carrying it across the snow. The figure was human, though she could not be sure. Everything was hazy, the freezing air clouding her thoughts. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary person. This human, if it truly was a human, seemed almost as if they belonged to the storm itself, a creature of the cold, unafraid of its cruel embrace. The figure reached her in seconds, kneeling down beside her with the fluidity of someone accustomed to combat or survival. In an instant, the human was removing his gear, revealing the cold, tactical clothing beneath, designed not just for warmth, but for battle, for survival in hostile environments like this. His face, partly covered by a hood and scarf, was rugged, hardened by time and experience. But his eyes were filled with something else entirely. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, just a sharp, unwavering focus as he assessed the alien before him. The alien's breath hitched as the cold overwhelmed her once more. Her vision faded, the world closing in around her, but the human was already acting. With a swift motion, he removed a small, heated device from his pack and placed it against her chest. It hummed to life, emitting a soft glow as it began to warm her, fighting against the cold that sought to end her life. She could feel the warmth slowly creeping through her skin, a feeling she had not known in what seemed like forever. Her breath came more easily now, though it was still labored, and her mind began to clear. Through half-closed eyes, she saw him working quickly, his hands moving with expert precision as he checked her vitals, adjusting his gear to accommodate her. His breath, visible in the cold air, came in steady puffs, as if he was completely at ease in this deadly landscape. "Stay with me," the human spoke, his voice low but firm. It was the first sound she had heard in what felt like an eternity. There was an unspoken command in his tone, a strength that cut through the fog of her thoughts. "Stay with me." She tried to focus on his words, but her body refused to respond. Her limbs felt numb, her strength failing her completely. Who is this? The thought was fragmented, broken, but there was something in the way he moved, the way he cared for her without hesitation. He wasn't just saving her, he was determined to save her, to pull her from the edge of death. With a final, determined effort, the human hoisted her up into his arms, cradling her like a fragile thing. His strength was overwhelming, and despite the weight of the freezing conditions, he moved with purpose and speed. She felt herself being carried, though everything seemed to blur together. His warmth was the only thing that kept her tethered to life, and it was all she could do to remain conscious. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, but it didn't matter. The cold had lost its grip on her, and the human had not faltered. He pressed forward, his movements steady and unyielding, as if he knew exactly where he was going. His mind was focused on one thing, survival. The alien closed her eyes, exhaustion threatening to take her again, but she couldn't help the small thought that crossed her mind. Why? Why would he save me? And in the silence of the storm, a voice answered her, soft yet resolute. Because you're worth saving. The alien's eyes snapped open, the words lingering in the air as they journeyed onward through the frozen wasteland. Her story was not over, not yet. The human's movements were fluid and precise as he continued to traverse the treacherous landscape of Seriphus, the alien cradled carefully in his arms. He moved with an almost unnatural ease across the ice and snow, as if the harsh terrain were a second home to him. His breath, though visible in the icy air, was steady and controlled. He had been through worse than this, faced environments far more hostile than the frozen plains of Seriphus. But this was different. He didn't know who she was, or even what she was. Her alien form was unlike anything he had seen before, her skin a shimmering violet hue, her body slender and delicate, yet undeniably strong. But there was something else about her, something that gnawed at his instincts, something beyond the immediate need to save her. Perhaps it was the sheer grace she radiated, even in the face of death, that made her so striking. Or perhaps it was her vulnerability that drew him in. She wasn't just another alien to him. She was something else. As he made his way toward the faint glow of his emergency shelter, hidden deep within the frozen caves of Seriphus's mountainous region, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm itself was watching them. The winds howled louder, the snow swirling with an intensity that made it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. But he had learned to trust his instincts, honed through years of survival on the harshest planets. He knew the way. With every step, the alien's limp body felt heavier in his arms, her breath shallower and more labored. Despite the warmth of the heated device strapped to her chest, she wasn't out of danger yet. The cold had ravaged her body, and it would take more than a few minutes of warmth to bring her back from the edge. The shelter was close now, just over the ridge. It wasn't much, a small structure designed for emergency use, but it was well stocked with supplies and a reliable heat source. His mind briefly wandered back to the mission that had brought him to Seriphus in the first place. He wasn't here by accident. He was part of a deep space expedition investigating anomalies in the region, but everything had gone wrong from the start. The rest of his crew was either dead or stranded, and now he was alone on a hostile planet with an alien he had no way of understanding. But that was a problem for another time. Right now, he had one priority, her. As he finally reached the entrance of the shelter, he carefully lowered her to the ground, setting her gently on the cold stone floor. He wasted no time, immediately pulling out the small, collapsible thermal blanket from his pack and wrapping it around her fragile form. He checked her pulse once more, still faint but steady. She wasn't dead, not yet, but the signs were unmistakable. She was far from okay. He moved quickly, working with practiced efficiency as he adjusted the shelter's heating system, cranking it up to its highest setting. The temperature inside the shelter began to rise, the air filling with the warm hum of the unit as it battled against the freezing cold outside. But the human didn't stop there. He quickly began administering a series of medical treatments, using small syringes and tools from his emergency kit. The alien's physiology was unlike anything he had ever encountered, but his training had prepared him for this. His crew's mission had been designed to deal with the unknown. He had studied species from across the galaxy, and although he had no direct knowledge of her species, he wasn't about to let that stop him. He worked for hours, his focus never wavering. He watched her carefully, adjusting the devices, monitoring her vitals. Her body was slowly beginning to respond, but it wasn't enough. He had to push further. As the heat from the shelter enveloped them, he took a moment to glance at her again. Her features were otherworldly, yet strikingly beautiful in their own way. Her skin was smooth, almost metallic in the dim light of the shelter. Her long, dark hair had thawed and now framed her face in loose waves. Her lips, though pale, carried a certain softness, and her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, a sign that she was recovering, albeit slowly. She was alive. He had done it. For now. But he couldn't help but wonder, why had she been on Seraphis? What had brought her to this frozen hellhole? There were few explorers who ventured into this part of the galaxy, and even fewer who survived the extreme conditions. He had heard rumors of research stations and abandoned settlements, but nothing concrete. As his mind wandered, he noticed her stirring. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment, they seemed confused, distant, as if she were seeing a world she couldn't quite understand. Her gaze landed on him, the human, and her brow furrowed slightly, as though trying to place him. "You're awake," he said, his voice calm, though there was a hint of relief in it. He leaned back slightly, allowing her space to regain her bearings. Her voice came weakly, but with an edge of clarity. "Where am I?" "Safe," he replied, giving her a reassuring nod. "You're in a shelter. You're going to be okay. For now." She blinked several times, as though trying to piece together the fragmented thoughts in her mind. The cold. The storm. The crash. And then, him. The human. She had never encountered a being like him before, not in all her travels across the stars. But there was something about him, something that made her trust him instinctively. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The human hesitated for just a moment. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know if he had a reason, other than the fact that it was simply the right thing to do. He had rescued countless people before, but something about her presence, had made him act faster than he ever had. He sat down beside her, his expression unreadable. "Because you're worth saving," he said simply, his voice firm but gentle. "I couldn't just leave you out there." She studied him, her gaze intense as she tried to understand this strange human. A species known for its brutality, its relentless will to survive, but also for its compassion when it counted. Her eyes softened, just for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, though she didn't fully understand what she had just said. He nodded, his focus already returning to the task at hand. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for now, they had each other's trust. And that was a start. The storm outside raged on, but inside the shelter, warmth and survival had found a fragile truce. The human and the alien were bound by fate in this frozen wasteland. And though neither knew it yet, this encounter would change the course of their lives forever. The alien's eyes fluttered open again, her mind still heavy with the fog of cold and exhaustion. The warmth of the shelter, the soft hum of the heat generators, were all a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. She could feel the blankets wrapped around her, the sensation of warmth slowly bringing life back to her limbs. Yet, her body still felt like a shell, fragile and weak. Her senses were muted, and everything seemed distant, as if she were floating in a dream. Beside her, the human remained vigilant. He had not left her side since she regained consciousness, watching her carefully as if he feared she might slip away again. His presence was constant, reassuring, though she couldn't quite understand why he seemed so determined to save her. She didn't know his name, nor did she know what kind of being he was. The language he had spoken was unfamiliar, but there was something in his tone, in his gaze, that suggested he meant her no harm. How long? Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was the first sound she had made since regaining consciousness. The words felt alien in her own throat, as if her body hadn't quite adjusted to speaking in a language it wasn't accustomed to. The human leaned forward, his face illuminated by the dim light of the shelter. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were steady. It's been a few hours. You're stable now. But you need to rest. The alien nodded slowly, processing his words, though she didn't fully understand their meaning. She knew rest. But stable was a word she wasn't entirely familiar with. Her homeworld's language had no direct translation for such concepts. The idea that her life had been teetering on the edge of death, and that someone had pulled her from that brink, was a strange, uncomfortable feeling. She had been alone, lost, on a hostile planet, until this human had found her. But why? What was it about her that made him care enough to save her? She wanted to ask, to learn more about this strange creature who had so selflessly risked his own life for hers, but her body was still heavy with the aftereffects of the cold. Her eyelids fluttered, and her vision swam as exhaustion overwhelmed her once again. Before she could drift back into unconsciousness, a sound pierced through the soft murmurs of the shelter. The human was speaking, but his words were not meant for her. They were spoken into a small device, his voice low and urgent, though she couldn't make out the details. She recognized the tone of command, of someone giving instructions, of someone trying to get information. The alien's thoughts snapped back to clarity, and she focused on the human once more, trying to make sense of her situation. What is he saying? When he finished speaking into the device, he turned to her, his expression softening. I've been trying to get a signal through to my ship. But the storm's interference is too strong. I've got a team waiting for me out there, but it's going to take time before they can reach us. The alien's eyes widened, confusion knitting her brow. Team, she asked, her voice still rasping, as if the simple words had to fight their way out of her throat. She had heard the word before, but it was never used in relation to her. The concept of a team was foreign to her, something that hadn't been part of her solitary existence. Yes, the human replied, his tone firm but patient. I'm not alone in this. There are others. We'll get you home. She wanted to ask more, about who these others were, and how he could be so sure they would come, but something about his words made her pause. Home. The idea of returning home felt distant, uncertain. She had no idea where home was anymore, only that she had been far from it for far too long. Her mission had been a fool's errand. She had been chasing after an anomaly, something that no one else seemed to care about, and now here she was, stranded on a dying planet with a human who seemed determined to keep her alive. She let her thoughts drift for a moment, the sounds of the shelter's hum and the warmth lulling her into a strange state of semi-consciousness. The human had saved her. But that wasn't enough for her. She had to understand. Why? Why did you save me? She asked again, her voice stronger now, but still uncertain. I'm nothing like you. I don't even know if I'll be of any use to you. The human's face softened at her words, though his expression was still resolute. Because I can't let someone die if I can help it, he replied simply, as though the answer was obvious. He leaned in closer, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. We're all just trying to survive out here. All of us. Whether we're human or alien doesn't matter. You've got a second chance at life, and I'm not going to let that go to waste. The alien stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. Her species had never been concerned with concepts like survival in the same way humans were. They had always seen themselves as part of the universe, not separate from it. But the human's words carried weight. He wasn't saving her out of pity or obligation. He was saving her because he believed it was the right thing to do. She closed her eyes, letting out a soft sigh. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're risking your life too." The human didn't respond right away. His gaze turned distant, as if he were considering her question deeply. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "It's not about the risk. It's about what happens if we do nothing." The alien frowned, trying to process his words. She had never encountered a being who saw the world this way, who would risk everything, not for wealth, not for power, but for something as intangible as right. She had studied humans before, in a distant galaxy, through data reports and intercepted transmissions, but there was no manual for understanding the depths of their character. "We don't let others die when we can do something about it," he added, his tone quiet but unwavering. It was a simple philosophy, one that seemed to guide him through everything he did. And in that moment, the alien understood something important: this human wasn't just a survivor. He was a protector. She let the words settle into her mind, her gaze never leaving his. For the first time since she had crashed on Seraphis, she felt a spark of something she had thought lost: hope. The human had saved her. And, in return, she would help him. She didn't know how yet, but the cold, distant world she had landed on was no longer so hopeless. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for this." The human gave her a soft, lopsided smile. "You don't have to. Just stay alive. That's all I'm asking." And in that moment, the alien realized that, perhaps, survival wasn't just about existing. It was about trust. About the bond that could form between two beings from completely different worlds, united by something more powerful than circumstance. In the depths of the freezing wilderness, surrounded by the endless white expanse, two very different lives had crossed paths. And the story of survival, of courage, and of hope, had only just begun. The alien's recovery had been slow, but steady. Each day she felt stronger, her body adapting to the warmth of the shelter and the strange, foreign atmosphere that she had been thrust into. Her mind, however, was still a jumble of confusion and questions. She had little recollection of the events leading up to her crash on Seraphis, only fleeting images, broken memories that didn't make sense. The human, for all his kindness and efficiency, hadn't answered many of her questions. He had been focused on survival, on keeping her alive long enough for help to arrive, and for now, that was enough. The storm outside had lessened in intensity over the past few days, and the human had ventured out, making regular trips to check the surrounding area and ensure their shelter remained undisturbed. Each time he returned, he would give her a brief, reassuring smile before settling into his routine. His presence was a constant, and while it should have been a comfort, it also made her feel strangely uncomfortable. She had been alone for so long, her mission had been one of solitude, of discovery. Now, in this alien place, she was forced to rely on another being for her very survival. Yet, something about the human kept her grounded. There was a quiet confidence in him, a strength that seemed to radiate from within. She had seen him in moments of silent thought, his gaze distant, his hands tense at his sides. She wondered what weighed on him, what drove him to risk so much to save a stranger, especially a stranger like her. She could feel that there was more to his story, something he wasn't sharing, something buried deep within him. One evening, after he returned from his latest foray into the blizzard, the human sat down across from her in the shelter, his face more somber than usual. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the exhaustion in his posture, but he did not speak of it. Instead, he began preparing something to eat, rummaging through his supplies with a practiced hand. For the first time, the alien spoke up. "What is it that you're running from?" The human froze for just a moment, his movements stilling as if her words had cut through the air like a blade. He didn't meet her gaze at first, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of crackling fire and the soft hum of the shelter's heat. But then, slowly, he turned his eyes toward her. "Running from?" he asked, his voice low, as though the question itself was unexpected. "I'm not running from anything." She didn't believe him. There was a weariness in his eyes that betrayed his words, a hidden sadness that he couldn't mask. She had learned to read the smallest of details in the creatures she encountered throughout her travels, and this human was no exception. The walls he had built around himself were just that, walls. And walls could be broken. "Not running," she pressed gently, though she felt the weight of the question in her own chest. "Then what are you trying to escape?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he paced to the far side of the shelter. She watched him, sensing the conflict inside him, the inner turmoil that he was clearly struggling to suppress. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, the alien saw a flicker of emotion on his face, anger, perhaps, or guilt. "There's nothing to escape," he said finally, his voice harsh, like he was forcing the words out. "I'm just trying to survive. That's all." The alien frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Survive? From what?" She paused for a moment, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You're not alone. You said you had a team." The human's expression shifted. He turned back to her, his eyes hardening. "They're gone. Dead. I'm the only one left." The words hung in the air between them like a thick fog. The alien felt a cold pang in her chest, sympathy, maybe even sorrow. She had sensed the weight of his words, but she hadn't understood the full extent of his loss until now. His team had been wiped out, and here he was, stranded on a frozen planet, with only a wounded alien to look after. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. "I didn't know." He shrugged, as if trying to dismiss the topic, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "It's not your fault. It happened before I even knew you were here. I had no way of knowing." He paused, and for a moment, the shelter seemed colder despite the warmth. "We were on a mission, trying to explore the unknown. But the storm hit. The ship went down, and everything else after that was just trying to keep going." The alien studied him, her curiosity piqued. She had heard of such missions before, exploration teams sent to uncharted planets, venturing into the vast unknown to learn and discover. But it was clear now that the human had experienced far more than just the physical dangers of survival. His team's loss had been more than just a tragedy, it had shattered something in him. "There's always more to the story, isn't there?" she asked softly, her gaze never leaving his. "Something you're not telling me?" He didn't answer right away. His expression darkened, his eyes flickering with some unseen emotion before he turned away, staring out into the endless white of the storm outside. The alien could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched as if he were battling the urge to lash out. "Sometimes," he said quietly, his voice distant, "the hardest part of surviving is not the planet, not the storm, but the things you leave behind. The people you couldn't save." The alien nodded slowly. She understood that more than she cared to admit. She had faced her own share of losses, her own regrets, though her people rarely spoke of such things. Emotions like these were often buried deep, out of sight. But the human's words resonated with her. The weight of isolation, the weight of failure, it was something she had carried for a long time. She couldn't deny the bond that was beginning to form between them, the shared understanding that they were both survivors in this cold, unforgiving world. "I know what it's like," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been there too. Not with a team, but I've lost things, people. Things I'll never get back." He turned back to her then, his expression softening, though there was still a deep sadness in his eyes. "I don't know what you've lost," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I think I'm starting to understand what it feels like to be alone." The alien's heart clenched, a pang of empathy coursing through her. It was the first time she had heard the human admit something so raw, so vulnerable. In that moment, she realized that he wasn't just a rescuer or a protector. He was a man carrying the scars of his past, the weight of a life that had been shattered and remade by the brutality of the universe. "I'm sorry," she said again, but this time it wasn't just for his losses. It was for the understanding that had bloomed between them, for the recognition that they were both shaped by their experiences, both struggling to survive in a universe that had no mercy. The human gave a small nod, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We'll get through this," he said quietly, as if making a promise, not just to her, but to himself. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the shelter, a fragile understanding had begun to form between them. They were no longer just an alien and a human, two separate beings struggling against the elements. They were survivors, bound by the shadows of their pasts and the uncertain future that lay ahead. In the cold expanse of Seriphus, amidst the endless white snow and the biting winds, they had found something rare, something that might be their only hope for survival, each other. Days passed, each blending into the next as the storm outside began to subside. The human, whom the alien had learned was called Ethan, continued his routine of checking the perimeter, ensuring the shelter remained secure. He seemed like a man with a singular focus, survival. His days were filled with action, with tasks he performed without hesitation, as though he had done them countless times before. But the nights were different. In the quiet, after the last of his tasks were completed, he would sit in silence, his gaze lost in the distant, shifting white of the storm. The alien, still unnamed in her own mind, had taken to quietly observing him. She had spent so many years learning about alien species and their cultures, but this human, with his strange emotions and complex thoughts, intrigued her more than anything she had encountered before. She had never seen someone so driven by the need to protect, to survive, to rebuild. His determination was unwavering, but there was also a softness beneath it, an emotional depth that she couldn't quite place. She was still trying to make sense of her own situation. The memories of her mission, her crash, and her previous life remained fragmented, pieces scattered like the snow outside. What had she been doing on Seriphus? Why had she been chasing this anomaly? Her species, the Ja'are, were explorers by nature, but they were also solitary. Her mission had been one of personal discovery, one that had gone terribly wrong. But here, in this shelter, in the presence of this human, she found herself confronting a different kind of survival. It wasn't just about keeping her body alive. It was about understanding this connection, this unexpected bond that was forming between them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the icy landscape outside, Ethan returned from his latest foray into the storm. His face was more drawn than usual, his body stiff with exhaustion. He had been gone longer than normal, and the alien had grown concerned. When he stepped through the entrance, she immediately noticed the grim expression on his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He took a long, slow breath before meeting her gaze. "I found something," he said quietly, his voice strained. "Found what?" The alien felt a surge of tension, a knot forming in her stomach. Was it a sign of rescue? Had the storm caused more damage than they realized? Or had they found something dangerous? Ethan hesitated before he spoke again, his tone heavy. "It's a signal. It's faint, but it's there. A distress call." The alien's pulse quickened. A distress call. It could be anyone, another human survivor, another expedition team, or even someone from her own species. 1,000 possibilities rushed through her mind, each one more desperate than the last. "Who is it?" she asked, standing up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know," Ethan replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's encrypted. Too many layers of interference. I can't break it yet, but it's coming from somewhere near the planet's equator. Far from here." The alien's mind raced. The equator, far from here. It was a treacherous journey, with the blizzard still lingering, the temperatures unpredictable. But a distress signal, it was a call for help. She understood that instinctively. She had to go. She had to know who it was. "You're going after it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan's gaze was resolute, and she saw the familiar set of determination on his face. "I don't have much choice," he said, his voice hardening. "If there's anyone out there, they could be in worse shape than we are. We have to check." The alien studied him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and concern. Ethan's sense of duty was clear, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. They were far from equipped to deal with whatever this distress call meant. The storm had crippled their resources, and though they had enough food for a few more weeks, the journey to the equator would take days, maybe longer. It wasn't a risk he could take lightly. "You can't go alone," she said firmly, stepping closer to him. "It's too dangerous. You'll need help." He shook his head, the line of his jaw hardening. "I can't risk both of us. The journey's already going to be tough enough. If something happens to one of us, I can't leave you behind." The alien regarded him silently, sensing that his decision was already made. There was no arguing with him. Once Ethan made up his mind, there was no changing it. But she also knew something else: she wasn't going to let him go alone. Not after everything he had done for her. "You're not leaving without me," she said, her tone brokering no argument. "I've survived worse than this. I'll be useful." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "I owe you this. You saved my life, and I will not sit here waiting when I can help." For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. He seemed to weigh her words, and then, finally, he nodded. "Fine," he muttered. "But I'm holding you to that. We move together, no exceptions." The alien nodded in agreement. She knew the risks. She had been in countless dangerous situations, exploring unknown worlds, facing down predators in harsh environments. The human's resilience was admirable, but he didn't understand the stakes the way she did. This distress signal wasn't just a call for help. It was a warning, and they had no idea what they were walking into. That night, they prepared. Ethan made sure they had everything they might need: extra rations, warm clothing, tools for navigating the frozen terrain, and a communication device that might allow them to call for backup if necessary. The alien helped where she could, though her knowledge of human equipment was limited. Still, her skills as an explorer, honed over years of venturing into unknown territories, were invaluable. She worked swiftly, checking and double-checking their gear. When morning came, the storm had calmed to a light flurry. The wind still howled, but the temperature had risen slightly, making the conditions more bearable. Ethan led the way, his footsteps sure in the snow. The alien followed close behind, her senses alert to the slightest change in the atmosphere. As they made their way toward the equator, the silence between them was filled only with the crunch of their boots in the snow, the soft whistle of the wind, and the distant, haunting howl of the storm. They had no idea what they would find, only that they couldn't ignore a call for help. Whatever awaited them, they would face it together. And though the weight of the unknown hung over them like a shadow, the alien couldn't shake the feeling that this mission, this journey, was far more than just survival. It was a test of trust, a test of what it meant to truly connect with another being in a universe that often seemed cold and indifferent. The winds began to pick up again as they moved deeper into the blizzard, the storm closing in around them. But no matter how fierce the snow, no matter how bitter the cold, the alien and the human pressed on. The distress signal was their only hope now, and there was no turning back. The journey through the blizzard was nothing short of grueling. With every step, the wind howled like an angry beast, the snow biting at their exposed skin. The temperature had dropped once more, the cold creeping under their layers of clothing and numbing their limbs. Ethan was leading the way, moving steadily through the thickening snow, while the alien, her strength bolstered by her species' resilience, followed close behind. They didn't speak much, words were wasted against the roar of the storm and the urgency that pushed them forward. For hours, they trudged through the snow, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter or the source of the distress signal. There was nothing but the endless expanse of white, snowflakes swirling through the air, the ground beneath their feet a blinding blur of frost. The alien could feel the weight of the journey settling into her bones. She could see Ethan's exhaustion mirrored in every line of his face. His movements were slower now, more labored, his breathing harsher with each passing step. The same desperation that had driven him to help her was now driving them both forward, toward an uncertain future. "We should stop soon," the alien suggested, her voice barely audible above the storm. "We need to rest." Ethan shook his head, not breaking stride. His eyes were fixed ahead, determined. "We're close. I can feel it. We keep going." The alien didn't argue. She had seen this drive in him before, the unwavering determination to reach a goal, no matter the cost. But it wasn't just determination she saw. It was fear. Fear that if they stopped, they wouldn't be able to start again. The fear of failure. And that fear, she knew it all too well. She had faced her own demons, her own loss, but there was something about Ethan's quiet resolve that struck a chord in her heart. The human wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to save something, to hold on to a piece of himself that had been lost in the wake of the disaster. It wasn't just his team he had lost, it was a part of his very soul. And maybe, just maybe, this distress signal held the key to whatever hope was left in him. They continued, the storm pushing them forward like an unseen hand, forcing them to march into the heart of the unknown. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. The passage of time felt irrelevant now, just a blur of cold, snow, and grit. Finally, just when the alien thought she couldn't take another step, the storm cleared for a brief moment. The wind died down, and the snow fell more softly, as if giving them a reprieve. Ahead of them, barely visible through the fading mist, something appeared, a structure, dark and jagged against the pale white of the snow. Ethan's pace quickened, and for the first time in hours, a flicker of hope lit in the alien's chest. "There," Ethan said, his voice tight with both relief and apprehension. "That's it. That's where the signal is coming from." The alien squinted, her sharp vision able to discern the outline of the structure more clearly now. It was a ship, an old, weathered vessel that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The hull was pocked with craters, and its surface was covered in layers of frost and snow. It wasn't a sleek, advanced ship like the one the alien had been traveling in. This was something much older, something that had been through more than its fair share of damage. But it was still standing, still sending out that faint, desperate signal. The two of them made their way toward the ship, their steps becoming more purposeful with every stride. As they approached, the alien noticed something strange. The ship wasn't just abandoned. There were signs of life. Fresh tracks in the snow, footprints leading up to the entrance, and faint light flickering through a crack in the ship's hull. Whoever had sent the distress signal was still alive. The thought sent a shiver of anticipation through the alien's spine. Ethan paused just before the entrance, his hand raised to signal the alien to stop. His eyes were scanning the ship's exterior with a sharp, analytical gaze. "Something's off," he murmured. "We need to be careful." The alien nodded, understanding the caution in his voice. There was no telling what kind of situation they were walking into, what kind of people or creatures might be waiting inside. Still, she could feel the urgency in Ethan, the need to find answers, to find someone, anyone, who could offer a glimmer of hope. Together, they carefully approached the entrance. The alien's heart beat in her chest, a rhythmic pounding that matched the tension in the air. Ethan reached for a panel on the ship's side, prying it open with practiced ease. The ship groaned as if it hadn't been disturbed in a long time, and with a final wrench, the panel gave way. Inside, the faint hum of life support systems buzzed, confirming that the ship's power was still active. Ethan gestured for the alien to follow, and they slipped inside. The interior of the ship was dim, lit by flickering emergency lights that cast long shadows across the walls. The air was stale, thick with the scent of aged machinery and old electronics. The faint echo of voices, muffled, strained, drifted through the corridors. They weren't alone. Whoever had sent the distress signal was in trouble. The alien's senses heightened as she followed Ethan deeper into the ship. The atmosphere was tense, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of clanging metal and the low hum of the life support systems. The walls were lined with outdated equipment, some of it in disrepair, others still functioning with a strange, stubborn efficiency. They moved carefully, knowing that every step could bring them closer to danger. Finally, they came to a small, dimly lit room near the center of the ship. Inside, a lone figure sat slumped against the wall, wrapped in a tattered blanket. The figure looked human, but the alien couldn't be sure. The person was pale, almost gaunt, their face hidden behind a mess of tangled hair. They were barely conscious, their breathing shallow and erratic. Ethan moved toward the figure with a sense of urgency. He crouched beside them, gently shaking their shoulder. The figure stirred, their eyes fluttering open, revealing the faintest glimmer of recognition. "Help," the figure rasped, their voice weak and hoarse. We need to get to the beacon, it's too late for me." Ethan's face tightened, and he nodded, placing a hand on the person's shoulder to steady them. "We're here. You're safe now." The alien watched the interaction with a sense of unease. The person was clearly in bad shape, too far gone to be of much use. But their words lingered in her mind. The beacon. The signal. It was more than just a call for help. It was a warning. A plea. The human looked up at Ethan, their eyes glassy and distant. "Get to the beacon, before it's too late." Ethan's grip tightened on the person's shoulder, but he didn't answer. He simply nodded and stood, turning to the alien. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight with resolve. "The beacon. It's the only way we can make sense of all this. It might tell us who we're dealing with." "What happened?" The alien nodded, her mind racing. The stakes had just become much higher. The distress signal, the strange figure, and the plea for them to reach the beacon, it was clear now that this was no ordinary rescue mission. Whatever awaited them, they weren't prepared. But they had no choice but to press on. Together, they moved toward the beacon, the weight of the unknown bearing down on them. The beacon loomed ahead, a towering structure embedded in the depths of the ship's core. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, an artificial heartbeat that had been sending out distress signals for days, perhaps longer. The air around it was cold, sterile, and thick with the smell of decaying technology. Ethan and the alien approached the source of the light, their footsteps quiet in the now dead silence of the ship. The dying figure they had found was now a distant memory, their request for help still hanging in the air like an unanswered question. The truth, the real reason for this beacon's existence, was just ahead. The alien felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had known there was more to this mission than just survival, but the significance of what they were about to discover was beginning to crystallize in her mind. She didn't know what she expected to find when they reached this beacon, but she feared the truth might be far darker than they could imagine. Ethan's grip on the tools he carried tightened with each step. His eyes were locked ahead, a fierce determination now joined with an edge of doubt. Something in the air was telling him that whatever they found here, they wouldn't be able to walk away unchanged. The entrance to the beacon chamber was located in a narrow corridor. The door was slightly ajar, its edges worn and cracked. The alien reached for the door handle, but before she could open it fully, Ethan stopped her with a raised hand. "Wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" For a moment, the alien froze, listening intently. A soft hum filled the room, a faint, mechanical pulse, something more than just the power running through the ship. It was rhythmic, almost as if it were alive, but it was unlike anything she had encountered. It wasn't just the ship's systems operating, this was something else. I don't hear anything, the alien replied, her senses more acute than Ethan's. Still, she couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. Come on, he said, his voice sharp now. We need to be careful. He pushed the door open slowly, just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was bathed in a soft, eerie glow. At the center stood the beacon itself, a spherical device connected to various cables and screens. It was sleek, metallic, and impossibly complex, its surface covered in symbols and designs she couldn't recognize. This wasn't any kind of human technology. In fact, the alien was certain it wasn't of her own species either. She had seen enough advanced machines to know that this was something different, something entirely alien. As Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes widened. He moved cautiously, his boots clicking against the cold metal floor. The alien followed, her eyes scanning the room with purpose, her mind racing. This wasn't just a distress beacon, it was a command center. A control hub of some kind. Her fingers tingled as she approached one of the glowing panels. Symbols danced across the screen, flickering as though responding to her presence. The ship's systems are still intact, she said softly. This technology is beyond anything I've ever seen. Ethan's gaze never wavered from the central beacon. His eyes narrowed, as if seeing something within its glow. I don't know if that's a good thing, he muttered. This is too much. This ship, this beacon, none of this makes sense. Before the alien could respond, a low, distorted voice crackled to life, filling the chamber. Help is too late for me. The voice was weak, crackling, but unmistakable. It was the voice of the person they had found earlier, the dying figure who had led them here. The alien's heart clenched in her chest. The figure had been trying to warn them, but there was something more they needed to understand. Ethan's face turned pale. He moved closer to the panel, pressing buttons, trying to bring up the source of the transmission. The alien's gaze shifted back to the beacon. She could feel it, something was stirring within its core, a faint hum, like it was reacting to their presence. What is it? Ethan asked urgently, turning back to her. What's happening? The alien hesitated, her fingers hovering over the controls. She was no stranger to complex technology, but this was beyond anything she had encountered. Then it clicked, she realized what this was. She had seen this before, on the planets she'd explored, in the archives of her people. This wasn't just a beacon. It was a trap. This is a weapon, she whispered, the words heavy in the cold air. It's designed to lure in ships. To bring them in, one by one, and then. Her words were cut off as the room suddenly plunged into darkness. The soft hum stopped, and for a split second, everything went silent. A cold, dead silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, the voice returned, but it was different this time. Clearer, more mechanical. Welcome, survivors. Ethan froze, staring at the alien in shock. The voice was no longer distorted, it was clear, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. It sent a chill through both of them. You have arrived. Congratulations. The voice was chilling in its calmness. The experiment has been successful. Ethan's pulse quickened. What experiment? He demanded. What do you mean? The alien's mind raced. She knew exactly what was happening now. The beacon wasn't just a distress signal, it was a trap, an invitation for those desperate enough to come in. But it wasn't a random lure, it was part of something far more insidious. Whoever had created this technology wasn't interested in survival. They were interested in testing humanity's limits. Ethan, the alien said, her voice sharp with urgency. This beacon is a weapon meant to test the survival instinct. The person we found, they were part of this. Their signal was designed to draw us in, to bring us here. The test will proceed. The voice continued, its tone utterly devoid of empathy. Now, you must make a choice. Ethan looked at the alien, panic creeping into his eyes. A choice? What are they talking about? Before the alien could answer, the walls around them began to vibrate, the hum of the beacon filling the room once again. The floor beneath them shifted slightly, revealing a hidden hatch leading downward into the bowels of the ship. There is only one way out. The voice said with finality. Find the core. Shut it down, or it will reset. Your survival depends on this. Choose. Without another word, the hatch slid open with a hiss, revealing a dark, foreboding passageway that stretched far deeper into the ship. The alien knew what they had to do now. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. They had been caught in the web of a larger, more sinister force. And if they didn't find a way to destroy the core of this twisted experiment, the cycle would repeat. More ships, more people, lured into the same trap. Ethan, the alien said, her voice filled with determination. We have to end this. If we don't, it will keep going, endlessly. We need to destroy the core. Ethan nodded grimly, his hand gripping the weapon at his side. He was a man of action, a man who didn't hesitate in the face of danger. But this was a different kind of enemy. And for the first time in their journey, the alien realized that no matter how much they fought, they might not be able to escape unscathed. Together, they descended into the depths of the ship, knowing that the true battle was just beginning. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.